Okay, so this is what I want you to know for chapter 12. We're talking about gender and sexuality in this chapter. And I wanted to get into some of the terms just so that we are all on the same page as far as the difference between gender and sex, essentially. The gender are the social and psychological dimensions of being male or female. This is socially and psychologically. You're either masculine or you're feminine. That's what gender refers to, whereas sex refers to the biological aspects of being male or female. So moving into understanding and some things with gender, talking about gender role typing, gender role and gender typing, for lack of a better word. It's gender role is this set of expectations that prescribe how females or males should think, act, or feel, essentially. These are our roles in our society. Usually these are influenced very much by culture, by society, and if you really look at our society, this has really changed over the last 100 years, even to the point of seeing more women in the workforce, women being able to vote, those kinds of things. So if you think about it, what changes have been good? Well, I think women being able to work in the workforce has been a good thing, or women being able to vote is a good thing. Well, what changes have been bad? And those are things to ask yourselves as you consider the idea of, okay, regarding the expectations and how males or females should think, act, or feel, how do we look at it, what's good and what's bad, and how do we figure it out? Well, obviously we need to take our cue from the Bible and put biblical principles, and I would say those changes that have allowed for maybe some change, some positive changes as far as how we expect women and men to act have been good as long as they follow a biblical principle and they don't usurp what the Bible says to be true about the differences between men and women. The idea of gender typing is the idea where when children grow up, they begin to acquire thoughts and feelings, behaviors that are considered appropriate for their gender in their particular culture. And obviously this is going to be different from one culture to another depending upon what country or whatever you are in. And how does this occur? And we're actually going to talk about some of those things of how that gender typing comes to be. And if you think about it, in our culture, so those thoughts and feelings and behaviors that are considered appropriate in our culture for years and years was not considered appropriate or normal for a young boy to show his emotions. And that would be an idea of gender typing. For years and years, it was not considered appropriate for a woman to make more money, essentially, than a man in the workforce. That would be considered gender typing. Some groups in our society obviously advocate making no distinctions between man or female in any area. And that is getting to be more and more of an issue. And I think your generation is going to see issues in this area just continue to rise and become a problem. And so you, as a Christian and a Christian educator, a Christian medical professional, Christian counselor, pastor, wherever God has you, you need to determine, okay, what is your stance on gender and role and typing and sex. You need to know this. You need to begin getting yourself settled on this issue so that when you go into wherever God has you in ministry, you can then attack issues from that standpoint, that biblical standpoint. There are biological influences, obviously, on gender. Hormones are a major influence on whether you are male or female. The estrogens are those female hormones that we had talked about at the beginning of the semester. They're produced by the ovaries, and the hormone estradiol, I don't know how to say that, it influences the development of those female sexual characteristics. And they also help the female to regulate her menstrual cycle. So obviously, if there's an issue with that hormone, you're going to have an issue with those things. On the flip side, the androgens are the male hormones, and they produce the testosterone that is instrumental in promoting the development of male genitals, sexual genitals, and they're also secondary sex characteristics. So hormones do play a role, contrary to what maybe popular culture would like you to think or like to tell you. Biology does play a large role in whether you are male or female. There's a link between sex hormones, obviously, and gender development. Kind of no surprise there. Impact of testosterone. Testosterone obviously is one of those hormones that people like to talk about and kind of like to joke about, and it has been linked to aggressive behavior and aggressive sexual behavior. Actually, some say increased sex drive even. Violent criminals. They have done studies where they've shown violent criminals have very, very high levels of testosterone. And even when they compare ministers or pastors or whatever to professional football players, they see a higher level in those who play football as opposed to those who have more of a non-aggressive life choice, essentially. So does testosterone maybe impact behavior? The studies seem to indicate so, and they're showing there is definitely a link between that and gender development. There are multiple theories on why theories on what gender is and how it comes to be. One of them is called the social influences theory or the social role theory that says that gender essentially is impacted socially. Their gender differences are caused by the contrasting social roles of men and women. So it's a social issue, essentially, which would eliminate the biological issue, and which honestly, probably with where our culture is today, they would grab onto something like this and hold on to it because of that. So the question then is there a natural, psychological, or biological based difference between the sexes? Or is behavior, attitudes, natural inclinations, are all that stuff, is that developed, shaped by culture, by media, by environmental forces? Let me ask it another way. Would men and women still think, act, and have distinctly male or female inclinations even in a sex-neutral environment? And you need to ask yourself, if you don't know the answer to that question, you need to figure it out. Bible would tell you that there is a definite difference between the two in a biological difference between the two. Now, are some of those differences maybe altered by the culture, by media, by environment? Definitely, I would say definitely yes. But this is the social role theory, essentially. In this, they kind of did a little play study, and they found the boys who play with boys were more aggressive. They were rough and tumble kind of a thing. And also related to their choice of toys and games, obviously, probably, you know, guns and all that kind of stuff. I remember when my children were little, my little boys were little, they made guns out of everything. I didn't teach them how to use a gun. We're not, you know, we're not an overly violent family, and yet they figured out they would make guns out of their peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. That was just kind of the way they came along. And then when they noticed that girls play with girls, they became less aggressive related to their choices of toys and games. If you think about it, often girls will sit and they'll play with their little dollies, or they'll play house, or they'll color, and boys are more aggressive and into the rough and tumble kind of a thing. So that is the social role theory. And then we come into the social cognitive or the behavioristic theories of gender. The social cognitive says that children learn gender essentially by observing and imitating their gender. So a young boy would learn and follow his father and imitate his father. A young girl would follow and imitate her mother. And obviously with this role, what happens to those, you know, those children that have two mommies or two daddies, and there's not really a delineation between the two. It does make you wonder. This is the social cognitive theory. So in other words, remember, cognitive means to think, and it's a social thing. So they're social thinking. They're observing and then they're imitating. That's the social cognitive. And then the behavioristic view looks and says parents or society in general really rewards or punish behaviors that they believe are to be inappropriate or appropriate for certain genders. So in other words, when a little girl acts like a little girl, she wears princess dresses and she colors and she plays with her dollies and she acts like she's a mommy, she gets rewarded. When she acts like a tomboy, she gets punished. And vice versa with the boys. When a little boy acts like a boy, he plays with guns and cars and trucks, he is rewarded, whereas when he plays and he dresses and plays with dolls, he is punished for his behavior. So this is the social cognitive and the behavioristic theories of gender. Then we go into the cognitive developmental theory of gender. And essentially what this is children's gender typing occurs after they think of themselves as boys or girls. So the gender typing, that's that process by which children acquire thoughts and feelings, behaviors that are considered appropriate for their gender. That typing actually happens after they actually think, oh, I'm a girl or I'm a boy. So they can't actually type themselves until they actually know if they're a girl or a boy, essentially. Once they consistently conceive of themselves as male or female, then they prefer those activities, objects, and attitudes consistent with this label. This goes in direct contrast to those people that would say girls just naturally gravitate toward the dolls and the mothering kind of activities, whereas boys naturally gravitate toward the trucks and the cars and the guns and the things like that. What the cognitive developmental theory is saying, nope, they don't do that until, oh, I am a girl, so therefore I do this, or I am a boy, so therefore I do this. Gender stereotyping. Obviously, stereotyping happens in our culture all the time with everything, and gender is no exception in that regard. So, stereotyping obviously are broad concepts that reflect our impressions, how we believe about what males and females should be, essentially. Well, when we look at the traditional views, as they call them, I would say maybe a little more biblical views of masculinity and femininity. Males are they have more instrumental traits, in other words, are more work-related, whereas females are more expressive. They're more relationship and nurturing oriented. And I would say those kinds of traits, when you look at the traditional views of masculinity and femininity, those are God-given, really, for many things. But stereotyping does vary with culture. It depends on the culture. If you look at some of the pagan cultures or some of the cultures that maybe are in the jungles, it might look even opposite in those cultures. There's also stereotyping of occupations. Obviously, certain occupations have always been feminine, while others have always been masculine. Think about the idea of a nurse. People have always thought of a nurse as a feminine occupation. Sometimes even teachers, elementary teachers, has always been looked at as a feminine occupation. A secretary has always been looked at as a feminine occupation. An airline stewardess has been more of a feminine occupation over the years. Masculine occupations would be those things, I would say, dealing with the outside, any kind of construction, and anything dealing with the hands. Those kinds of things would be more masculine in their approach. So there definitely is stereotyping in that regard, and we actually see our culture shifting a little bit in those stereotypes even now. Some claim that males are better at math and visuospatial skills, and females are better at verbal skills. And others also claim that those claims are totally exaggerated. So it depends on the research that you're looking at. I just really think it depends on the person and honestly the environment that you grow up in. And I do think that maybe there is something to do with the female brain. I do think females often, there is research to prove that females do provide more verbal words verbally in a day than the males do. So it would make sense that they're better at verbal skills, not necessarily a stereotype, but we've mentioned this before on standardized testing. Boys are usually better at math and science, and then girls are better at the reading and the writing, the reflective kind of a thing. The studies prove, though, that overall girls are better students than boys are, especially in the upper elementary and high school years. And that probably is just not necessarily a gender thing more than a maturity thing. And if you know anything about boys, often it takes boys a little longer to mature than it does girls. And really, it probably just has more to do with that than anything. Comparisons between male and females on an emotional level, essentially. Aggression, generally speaking, across the board, males are usually more physically aggressive. And then, with their bodies, punching and all that kind of stuff. If a male has a problem, generally speaking, they have more of a tendency to want to knock somebody's, face out. Whereas a female would have more of a tendency to actually attack verbally, be aggressive in the verbal area. Females definitely exhibit more relational aggression. Think of the Mean Girls thing, such as spreading rumors and gossip and slander and things like that. Guys don't usually have a tendency to kind of get involved in those things. They have more of a tendency to be more physically aggressive. And lest you think it's not a problem in Christian circles, the mean girl thing, the idea of slander and rumoring and gossiping is an issue. And I've actually even seen it at Maranatha. And it's an issue that is anti-biblical. And in fact, if you look at the word slander in the Bible, the Greek form of it means diabolos, which means devilish. So in other words, slander is literally you're acting like a devil when you do that, according to God's standards. And we need to be careful as females that we are not being aggressive, relationally speaking, even in our context at Maranatha. Emotional regulation, with that, I think this pairs really nicely with the aggression kind of an idea. Often males show less self-regulation of emotions, and then that leads to behavioral problems, which would, bespeak the aggression issue. Males are usually more likely to help and perceive danger. They just have this thing in them where they just go, and whereas women are more likely to volunteer to help a child. You see women in the nursery more often than you do the male, for instance. Girls often show more caregiving behaviors than boys. And when I look at even my own children, the difference between the boys in my family and the girls in the little girl in my family, I actually see that divide. My daughter is much more interested in caregiving than my two boys are. Males are more likely to show anger towards strangers and turn that anger into aggression, kind of like relating back to the last slide. Children form many ideas about gender even before the age of 3. They begin to understand the differences between girls and boys, essentially. However, boys have a tendency, especially in our culture, to receive more intense gender socialization. In other words, it's less acceptable for boys to dress as girls or play with dolls than it is maybe for girls to play with trucks and to play with guns and things like that. So it seems like the tomboy aspect of being a girl is more accepted, or it's more acceptable than it is for girls to act, or excuse me, it is for boys to act like girls in our society. There's sometimes mixed messages. The mothers want the boys to be neat and clean, and then the fathers want the boys to be involved in rough and tumble play, and there's this kind of divide in our culture. And there's the idea of the boy code. That is something that's been around for many, many years, where boys shouldn't express their feelings, or they shouldn't be so emotional. It's kind of like it's going against their nature to do that, and it's always been kind of squashed and put down to do that. It's called the boy code. In adolescence, the gender intensification hypothesis basically says that the differences between boys and girls become almost greater during early adolescence because of the increased social pressures, essentially, to conform to the traditional gender roles. And if you think about it, that makes sense. Hormones are raging at this time, bodies are changing, and we're seeing physically the difference between the two genders, so it makes sense that there would be social pressures as well to conform to either or. And again, same thing in adolescence. Honestly, in our culture especially, peers tend to be more tolerant of a girl with masculine traits, that tomboy kind of a trait, than a boy with feminine. Although I would say in our culture that's becoming less and less of a problem. Not necessarily in our Christian cultures, but in our secular culture, that is becoming to be a boy with feminine traits is becoming more and more accepted because of the tolerance of the LGBT way of thinking, essentially. Women do appear to have an evidence strength in developing and maintaining relationships when you compare them to men. And obviously, like I mentioned a couple slides ago, women definitely are considered more verbal than men are. So it makes sense that they maybe have an easier time of developing and maintaining relationships because they talk more. I want you to know the difference between rapport and report talk. Rapport talk, and if it makes sense, when you have a rapport with somebody, rapport is the idea of having an understanding with them. So rapport talk is when you have a language of conversation, you're establishing connections, you're having relationships. This is the kind of talk that is preferred by women. And if you think about it, to a woman, talk is interaction. Guys, if you've got a girlfriend, Generally speaking, she wants to talk with you. That means the world to her. That means that you're building a relationship to her. And if you're continually giving her only one-word answers, she's going to be very frustrated and feeling like you don't want a relationship with her, because to her, talk is relationship, it's interaction. On the other hand, men are a little different. They have more of what we call a report talk. They give information. They much prefer just to kind of give the facts, essentially. They focus on the information and the facts rather than the relationship. So in a rapport talk, a woman would be more apt to say, how are you doing? How has your mother-in-law been doing? I know she was in the hospital. Oh, how's Johnny doing in school? I know he has problems with that teacher. And whereas a man would say, maybe, how's your job going? Asking things for fact information as opposed to relationship information. It's just the difference between how we talk. And generally speaking, I know this is stereotyping, women prefer rapport talk, whereas men prefer report talk. Men may face role strain, essentially, expectations of their roles that are sometimes contradictory or maybe even inconsistent. Men often have a shorter lifespan. Usually men die before women do. It just is statistically proven that is the case, because they have higher rates of stress-related disorders. Their jobs usually often are higher stress level. Although we're seeing those numbers change now because women are taking more and more high impact and high stress jobs. And so that could be an issue as well. Some men obviously have a hard time figuring out the male-female relationship thing, figuring out how to be the head of their home. And some men, even in our culture, and you see this in the low-income culture a lot of the times, is they resort to abuse of their wives and of their children. And obviously this is never appropriate in any context. Many men have very little or no relationship with their father. Remember, going back to that boy code idea, boys are discouraged from showing their emotion, discouraged from being upset, discouraged from feeling, in a sense. And so therefore, they have a tendency not to do a lot of talking, rapport talking, if you will, with their fathers. And because of that, they have more of a tendency to be competitive with other men than they do to have that rapport kind of an idea with men. I do see this is a little better in Christian circles, I believe, than it is in the secular circles. You're going to see these issues with relationships with fathers and with other men more in secular circles than you will in Christian circles, but it still is something to consider as we look at men's gender development. Moving on to sexuality and understanding sex, obviously we're looking at this from a psychological viewpoint, but sex also can be we need to look at it also from a biblical viewpoint. And so let's talk a little bit about culture and how culture plays into sexual behavior in our culture. Obviously biology and culture are both factors in sexual behavior. Yes, biology meaning male-female, attraction, those kinds of things. And then culture plays a very large role in sexual behavior. If you think to our culture and our country, even 100 years ago, sexual behavior was manifested in a much different way 100 years ago than it is today, because our culture has changed and our view of sex has changed, not necessarily what I would say for the good. Sexual scripts refer to the idea that there are stereotype patterns of expectancies for how people should behave sexually, and people refer to the traditional religious script. It sounds so negative, and in a way it is negative in how they look at it. For years, if you were to talk about sex in church, sex was almost a curse word. It was looked down upon. It was something that you just did not. It was not talked about. In a good way, the idea was sex is only accepted within marriage. That's the only place it's accepted. We would agree with that. That is a biblical viewpoint. But another kind of, I think, erroneous view was sex was only for reproduction and only sometimes affection. And I believe that idea is not a biblical view. I do believe that sex is, obviously it's meant for reproduction because the Bible tells us to be fruitful and multiply, but it is meant it is meant to be more for affection and more to show your love to somebody, and as stated in the romantic script below, sex is synonymous with love. And so I think to get a really biblical view of sex, you need to kind of combine the traditional religious script and the romantic script together and make them one, and then you'll have a biblical view of sex. In our culture, really, the sexual script in our culture is neither of these. Sex is not necessarily synonymous with love. In our culture, it is often synonymous with just something that you want to do. It's hormones, it's whatever. I'm going to hook up with somebody. It's just something that we do in our culture. The idea of sexually transmitted infections has been an issue in our culture for many, many years. AIDS kind of came to the forefront in the late 70s and early 80s. It's a sexually transmitted disease, and it still does not have a cure. The human the HIV infection, they have ways of kind of keeping it under control, but they don't necessarily have a cure for it. Really, honestly, the only cure for HIV is it's no sex, period. If you don't want to get HIV, then you shouldn't have sex with myriads of people. And the problem that was happening with HIV is people were sleeping around and having sex with multiple partners, sometimes sex with same-sex partners, and this was creating this issue and passing this issue along. And people thought condoms would do it, and they found that condoms are not 100% effective when it comes to HIV, so this is a problem. More than 3 million teens a year in our country acquire a sexually transmitted disease. And these diseases back here, if you look at them, they, again, don't necessarily have a cure. You can control them for the rest of your life, but once you get them, then you keep them. And my question is this, idea, the fact that 3 million teens a year are affected by this, is this addressed in TV sitcoms and teen dramas? If you think about it, it really isn't. In fact, the idea of sex is encouraged and said to be a wonderful thing, and that you should keep doing this, and multiple partners and same-sex partners and all of that. And but the fact of the matter is they don't bring in the idea that, yeah, these sexual transmitted diseases, pregnancy, brokenness often are issues that are dealt with for those people who are sexually active before they ought to be. Moving on with rape. You all know what rape is. This is forcible sexual intercourse with a person who does not actually give their consent to do so. This has been something that's, it's seen in the news on a regular basis. In fact, just this year we had a major court case go into place with a college, actually I think it was a Stanford college student who was very well known on the swim team, who raped a young girl without her consent. And this is an issue that is a major issue on secular college campuses especially. And the major issue that comes to the forefront on the college campuses is the idea of date rape. And this is the idea that you are forced into sexual intercourse with somebody that you actually know. You don't give consent, but you actually know that person. Maybe you're on a date with them, or you know them just in a very casual way, maybe. The estimates are as high as 2/3 of college women reporting having been date raped at some point or another. A female raping a male does occur, but it occurs very infrequently, and obviously, generally speaking, males have more physical power over a female, but there are cases of females actually raping males. Obviously, this is a trauma. This would be considered a trauma for the victims, and not only the victims, but those close to them and walking through these waters with them. Statistics show in high school about 11% of females and almost 5% of males have been forced to have sexual intercourse with somebody that they didn't necessarily give consent to do that. This has become an issue. And some people ask the reason why, and I think there are many reasons why. The high percentage of TV shows, movies, and things that really encourage sex, but don't give the actual ramifications of it. I think maybe this is part of a problem. The sexualization of our culture in general really pushes this, I think, and obviously we live in a culture that people have rejected God, and they don't look at God's ways, and God's ways are sex within the confines of marriage is a beautiful thing, and when we get outside of those bounds, we are definitely in contrast to what it is that God would have us to do. Teens obviously tend to be very curious about sex, and that makes sense because their hormones are beginning to rage and they're beginning to feel things and see things that maybe they never noticed before, and they face that challenge of sexual arousal. It really becomes to almost a head, especially for young men at the adolescent stage. At the adolescent stage, there tends to be some kind of they don't usually go from being a virgin straight into having sexual intercourse. There usually is some kind of progression in sexual activity. They begin holding hands, they begin kissing, they begin petting, necking and all that kind of stuff, and then they move into either oral sex or intercourse itself, and it's usually a progression kind of a thing. And this is something that is not unheard of in Christian circles as well. I think oral sex is a big issue, even on Christian college campuses. I've counseled many young girls regarding this and the guilt that they carry regarding this, and this is an issue. Sex is sex is sex is sex, and oral sex is sex, and God says let sex wait until marriage and keep it in the confines of the marriage covenant, essentially. The likelihood of sexual activity increases as you get older, obviously. 62% of 12th graders and 77% of 20-year-olds in college have had sexual intercourse. That is a huge number if you really think about it. In the cities, we have more issues with those who are male, African American. Inner city teens report being the most sexually active out of all the groups that reported. These kids, honestly, adolescents are not emotionally equipped to handle sex, and I think you would agree with that. This is a biblical principle, really. The earlier involved they are in sex, the more likely they are to show adjustment problems down the road. Sex at an early age for girls, and we've mentioned this before, relates to lower self-esteem and depression and more sexual activity, lower grades in school, pregnancy, self-esteem issues down the road. And then sexual activity before the age of 16 is linked with drinking, drug use, truancy and delinquency, and school-related or academic problems. It is an issue. They are not emotionally equipped to handle it, and it creates major, major social, environmental, and academic problems for them when they do. Obviously, when you have more sex, you're going to have an increased risk of pregnancy because of this. And in that, we saw that male African American inner city people were the most common to be having sex. And then we move into, now they're in a low income setting, they're in an inner city setting, and now they have increased risk of pregnancies. They don't have the money, and yet they're having kids, and it's becoming an issue. There is proven research that says that the decreased risk of sexual intercourse and pregnancy is related to close relationship with parents and acceptance of parental values. So in other words, you've got a good relationship with your parents, you're going to have less of a chance of being sexually active, essentially, and getting pregnant. Actually, overall, adolescent pregnancy rates are decreasing. They have been decreasing for the past decade or so. The decreased risk of pregnancy is related to a close relationship with parents and acceptance of parental values, like I mentioned before. I'm sorry, that was a little bit of a redundancy there. The consequences of adolescent pregnancy, obviously, are health risks for mothers and children, low birth weight, which if you remember, low birth weight more often than not translates into major intellectual or academic disabilities down the road. And obviously, it's an increased risk for the mother to drop out and end up on welfare. Many, many pregnant teens drop out of school. Why is this such a problem? Well, sexual activity no longer brings a shame and humiliation to teens like it did, like I mentioned, 100 years ago. It is much more accepted by our society in general and by the media especially. Psychological reasons, there's loneliness. Girls are trying to maybe get back at dads that aren't giving them attention. Boys being macho, like this is the thing I gotta do, man. Those kinds of things. There's a sense of invulnerability. Remember that personal fable idea? Oh, this isn't gonna happen to me. I'm not gonna get pregnant. And obviously, there's lack of moral conviction in our society. Society once based what they thought about sex on biblical principles, and now it's based on personal preference and whatever, frankly, the media or society has to say about it, and that definitely does not match up with what God has to say about it. What happens to those little babies? Well, many of them, 30% of those babies, as of 2013, 30% of adolescent babies are aborted. And over half of them are live birthed, and then about 15% of them are miscarried. So what happens to those babies? They're given up for adoption in some cases. Some cases they're reared by grandparents, and then in some cases they're reared by the mother, who drops out of school to take care of her children, and more often than not ends up on welfare. I thought this study was really interesting, that men and women who are virgins at age 18, when evaluated approximately 20 years later, almost age 40, had about half the risk of divorce, had completed about an additional year of education, and had annual incomes nearly 20% higher than those who were not virgins at age 18. I thought that was an interesting study, and it makes sense. When we follow God's principles, He blesses those who follow Him. And sex is something that's important to God, and He takes it very seriously, and we as Christian young people need to make sure that we have a biblical view of what God thinks about sex.